They sipped tea like they invented peace. But Britain didn't civilize the world, it just branded its violence in cursive. This is the story of the empire that broke the globe in a three-piece suit. The empire that said God saved the queen while it starved India, enslaved Africans, and drew borders with a butter knife. At its peak, Britain controlled 25% of the Earth's land and 20% of its population. It didn't just conquer, they rewired the world around white supremacy, profit, and polite propaganda. And today, the chaos they caused is still playing out in Palestine, Nigeria, India, Sudan, Ireland, you name it. But it wasn't just war or theft, it was something deeper. Britain perfected a system of power without presence. They could walk away from a colony while leaving behind everything: the flag, the law, the gun, the lie. So if you ever wondered how the planet ended up like this, why the poorest nations speak English, why the richest corporations trace back to shipping companies, or why oppressed people are told to act civilized, you're probably looking at the fingerprints of Britain. Let's talk about the empire that broke the world and never picked up the pieces. Look, before Britain ruled the seas, it got slapped around on land. In the year 43, the Romans invaded and colonized southern Britain, ruling for nearly 400 years. By the year 793, Vikings raided Lindisfarne, launching almost 250 years of attacks and settlements. By the year 1066, William the Conqueror takes over England. It wasn't just a battle, it was a hostile corporate takeover. That's right, Britain got colonized long before it learned how to colonize anyone else. What we now call England used to be a collection of rival kingdoms: Mercia, Wessex, Northumbria, each trying not to get burned down. Each kingdom ran on feudal survival rules. You swore loyalty to the guy with the sword, worked his land, and prayed the next raid didn't burn your village down. There was no England, just a fractured grid of warlords playing king. Then came the Black Death. Between 1348 and 1351, half the population died, fields were empty, feudalism was cracking. By the late 1300s, England was broke, traumatized, and teetering. So what did they do? They got obsessed with control. Land, language, law. They outlawed Welsh, crushed Irish uprisings, and in 1611, they printed the King James Bible not just as scripture, but as imperial propaganda. God now spoke English, and his will just happened to align with the king's. Religion wasn't just faith, it was branding. Britain didn't just want to rule your land, it wanted to rule your soul with the translation. And then they hit the ocean. Spain had already stolen half the world. Portugal was cashing sugar in Brazil, but Britain was like, yo, what if we do this whole thing cleaner? They didn't invent empire, they franchised it. No one saw it coming, not from this soggy island of tea and trauma. But trauma's a hell of a motivator. Look, empire wasn't just violence, it was a business model. And Britain became the CEO. By the 1600s, England realized it didn't need to invade every country. It just needed charters and ships. Enter the East India Company in the year 1600 and the Royal African Company in the year 1660. Two corporations with war powers and divine permission. They were backed by royal charters run by aristocrats and funded by investors. Literally, Wall Street meets white Jesus. The East India Company ran ports, built armies, and taxed millions in India before the British government ever got involved. The Royal African Company was even worse. It shipped over 100,000 Africans into slavery and branded them with RAC on their chests. Religion was the grease. Clergy claimed the British had a duty to civilize the savages. Missionaries brought Bibles, then merchants brought chains, and when resistance rose, redcoats followed. They weren't just stealing land, they were structuring systems. Slave plantations in the Caribbean, indentured servitude in India, colonial taxation in Africa, export-only economies everywhere. Each colony became a vending machine Britain never restocked, and all the profit flowed back to London, into banks, into buildings, and a British museum, where to this day they still display stolen artifacts behind velvet ropes like it's a gift shop, not a crime scene. So no, Britain didn't just build an empire, it outsourced oppression, it branded it into scripture, and called it trade. Here's the trick that made the British Empire eternal, even after it left. They didn't just conquer lands, they cracked cultures. Wherever they went, they asked, who here already hates each other, and how can we make it worse? Then they sharpened the lines: tribe versus tribe, caste versus caste, Christian versus Muslim versus Hindu. And once the people were fighting each other, Britain walked in like a referee with a flag and a tax code. Let's take India for example. Muslims and Hindus had coexisted under the Mughals for centuries. The British made communal identity a political category, splitting voting, schools, and resources. Result: partition in 1947 and over 1 million dead in the split between India and Pakistan. And a border that's still bleeding to this day. To this day, they were just firing missiles at each other like not even a month ago. It's really Yo, in Nigeria, hundreds of ethnic groups, three dominant ones, Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo, and British ruled them indirectly, appointing loyal chiefs and favoring one group over others. When Nigeria gained independence in 1960, the country erupted in coups and civil war. That chaos, it was designed. Britain drew borders that never built unity. In Sudan, they divided the North and South administratively, different rules, different leaders. North was Arab and Muslim, South was black and Christian. So when they left, they handed power to the North and said, good luck. And afterwards, we've had 50 years of civil war and a split nation. Look, this was not carelessness by Britain. It was a strategy. Britain engineered division so that locals will fight each other, not them. And when the smoke cleared, they blamed the violence on the people, never on the blueprint, the system, the plan, the strategy. To this day, the chaos in Myanmar, Iraq, Palestine, Kashmir, and Kenya, it all traces back to one thing: British maps, British lies, British logic. You ever break up with someone but keep the house keys, the bank account, and their last name? That's how Britain left its colonies. They didn't really leave. They just rebranded the empire as Commonwealth, like trauma with a logo. They left behind British-style courts and constitutions. On paper, justice. In practice, systems that criminalized protests, protected wealth, and favored the English-speaking elite. For example, in Jamaica, laws against public order offenses still echo from colonial times used to silence dissent. In Kenya, Mau fighters were tortured by British forces. The government only admitted it in 2013 after lawsuits after decades of denial. They set up financial systems that flow outward. Natural resources get extracted. Profits get routed through London banks. They even set up tax havens like the British Virgin Islands to protect stolen wealth. Result? Former colonies are now debt slaves to institutions that trace back to Britain's economic model. They left the English language as currency. If you speak it well, you rise. If not, you're left behind. Education, business, international aid, it all favors the colonial tongue. For example, in Zimbabwe, English is still the language of prestige, but native languages like Shona or Ndebele treat it as informal, even though they've survived centuries. The empire ended, but the operating system stayed. Britain left behind nations shaped in its image but trapped in its shadow. Flags changed, power didn't, and now the colonized get blamed for the mess that the colonizer designed. Here's Britain's greatest trick. They didn't just erase people, they erased the erasure. By the time they left their colonies, they had already started writing the story of their own greatness. Queens, Shakespeare, Churchill, and now the same empire that looted half the world gets invited to the cookout for bacon shows and BBC accents. In movies, films like The Crown frame colonialism as a costume drama. Downtown Abbey turns aristocracy into aesthetic. Even 1917, a war film, barely mentions the Indian or African soldiers that helped win that war. The camera cuts to London, not Lagos, not Kingston. The British Museum is full of stolen goods, but they call it world history. They'll display the Benin bronzes or Egyptian mummies with plaques like it's anthropology, not robbery. Meanwhile, demands to return artifacts still under review. Translation: we like your culture, just not in your hands. In education, British kids don't learn that their country ran concentration camps in Kenya or starved 4 million Indians in Bengal in 1943. They learn about the civilizing mission, explorers, and trade routes. They don't teach that Churchill said, "I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion." But they do teach that he was a hero. In the monarchy, the queen never apologized, the crown never paid reparations, but every royal wedding becomes a global feel-good story. Even though the crown jewels include the Kanora diamond, taken from India under threat of death. Britain turned the empire into a fairy tale, and now the world watches the sequel like it's harmless. But history doesn't vanish just because you filmed over it. It waits, it leaks, and one day the truth gets subtitles. Look, the British Empire is gone, but the damage, that's still here, in the blood, in the bank accounts, in the borders. You want to see it? Take a look at the map. Israel and Palestine, that border came from Britain's Balfour Declaration. Pakistan and India, Britain split the subcontinent with no plan and millions died. Sudan, Nigeria, Iraq, British lines, British lies. They drew borders with rulers, not reality. Then they dipped out. Yo, take a look at the money. Colonies were turned into extraction economies. Export sugar, cocoa, rubber, cotton. Now those same countries import what they used to grow, but at higher prices, because they never got to build the infrastructure. Debt, aid, and IMF loans are just new chains with interest. Let's take a look at the mind. In former colonies, people bleached their skin, straightened their hair, and speak English to get jobs. Internalized colonial logic still decides what's beautiful, what's smart, what's professional. Even when the chains are gone, the script remains. Okay, guys, look, Britain did indeed break the world, but it wasn't just Britain. It was a combination of four powers I want to talk about: Britain, Spain, France, and Portugal. Portugal often doesn't get included enough in these types of conversations in the first place. Okay, so I want to ask you guys, which one do you want to see next? We already did Britain, so do you want Spain, France, or Portugal? Just let me know. All right, cool. In the comments. Until next time, stay dangerous and stay away from them crazy ass people.